I started writing poetry when I was in high school. It's probably generous to call what I was writing poetry, but I was writing things down in lines. Really, the reason I say it wasn't poetry, it was more emotional desperation than anything, the way teenagers start writing poetry. I had feelings that I just didn't know how to cope with, and I began writing them down, and I felt better when I did it. Also, girls liked it. That was very helpful in high school.
Yeah.
When I went to college, I went to Grinnell College in Iowa. I had a wonderful teacher named Carol Parsonen, and I brought her my poems. And she did a most remarkable thing for me. Basically, I showed her my poems. She was my humanities teacher, not my poetry teacher. And she said, well, basically, you could be a poet. You have the intelligence, you have the passion, you have the imagination, but what you're writing is not poetry. Because you're just writing down your feelings. And you haven't read anything in poetry. You haven't joined yourself to poetry. And poetry is something that someone makes. So if you really want to become a poet, you should start reading other poetry and try and make something. So I did that. And I started, whenever I heard of a poet, I would go and read that poet. And by the way, if you do that for 40 or 50 years, you do learn something. And so I began then imitating what I was reading. And when I started to do that, when I started to make something, I actually started to become a poet rather than just a person who was writing poetry. The oldest word in Greek for poetry is poesis, which means making. A poet is a maker and a poem is a made thing. When I started to make something, I wasn't a good poet, but I was trying to become a poet.
And I know that you've spent some time in a few different cities in the U.S., right? You were born in Chicago, lived in Houston for a long time, now in New York. And you also spent a lot of time abroad, right? Like in Italy, Russia, you went on an embassy-sponsored program, I think, in Riga, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, aside from that, there's this idea of you're reading a lot of people, you're making something, but especially for this audience that's with us today, I think they'd be curious to know if those experiences abroad, I mean, how do they impact the making of poetry, the creative process, maybe?
Well, I should say, to back up a little bit, long before I started going abroad for the State Department and doing poetry events, I began reading poetry from around the world.
Okay.
That was for me much more crucial than the trips that I later took. When I was a sophomore and junior in college, my teachers were all American modernists, and I went to school on the poetry of American modernism of T.S. Eliot, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, Ezra Pound, and I began to feel that although I'm the child of these poets, I began to feel there was something a little cold in them. And I began to look for a poetry that was maybe a little more passionate, but also intellectual. And I began to find poetry in translation. I found the Eastern European poets like Czesław Miłosz and Zbigniew Herbert. I found the Russian poets like Osip Mandelstam, Anna Akhmatova, Marina Svetaeva. I found the Latin American poets like Cesar Vallejo and Pablo Neruda. And I began to formulate a different kind of model of what an American poet could be through my reading, because I found things in this poetry that I just didn't find in American poetry. So I would say later, when I went to Italy or when I went to Europe the year after I graduated from college, I spent a year on a fellowship traveling around Europe. I became more and more interested in the poetry of different countries. There's never been a culture without poetry. And every culture has a different poetry. And that poetry both speaks to us internationally, but also it speaks to something very specific in that culture. So anyway, I became a devoted internationalist in terms of my reading and my commitments to poetry.
Yeah. And could you expand, I guess, just a little bit? I'm curious what you meant when you talked about sort of the American tradition as being a little cold. I mean, because when I think about maybe some of the transcendentalist poets, or even later, you talk about Walt Whitman, who's sort of like held up as this poet of democracy and speaking on behalf of every man. I mean, what do you buy into that model, or do you think that there's something lacking there that you found elsewhere?
No, I'm an American poet, and I think Whitman is a great epic American poet. When I was speaking about coldness, I wasn't speaking about Whitman,
Okay.
and I wasn't speaking about Dickinson.
Okay.
So Dickinson is our great model of the passionate interior poet,
Sure.
tremendous cognitive abilities. Whitman, who I believe was a shy librarian, who had this dream of a kind of epic of democracy,
Right.
which, by the way, appealed to different poets all around the world. There were always Whitman followers. Mayakovsky in Russia, Pessoa in Portugal. There were always people who followed and understood what Whitman was doing as a constructor. What I meant was, early in the 20th century, there were a group of poets who turned against Whitman, who thought he was sentimental. And the great modernist poets who extricated us from the 19th century, especially Eliot and Pound. Pound believed that poetry should be sculptural, and that they thought that Victorian poetry was too sentimental. So they tried to make something that was colder, and something that was ironic, and something that distanced itself from the maker. It was probably a necessary move. But by the time I came along, that coldness was troubling.
Okay.
It was also their politics was also troubling to me, because they were right-wingers. And American poetry was falling in with right-wing movements in Europe.
Okay.
And I found that troubling. So what I mean was, in my rebellion against them and certain aspects of their work, I began to look for a different kind of model. And I wasn't the only one. I mean, there was a generation of poets before me who were leading the way on translation: Robert Bly and James Wright and Philip Levine and Galway Kinnell. Whole group of mid-generation American poets were trying to change American poetry.
Okay. No, thank you for that.
I don't mean to get too much into the
No,
weeds here.
no, that's great. I think sometimes, we were chatting earlier, and I was mentioning, I studied literature as an undergraduate. So, I mean, this stuff can be very exciting to me. But I think sometimes people who may not come from that background feel like, so what is it to me? Why I had to memorize, Robert Frost in high school. That's the last time I've, touched a poem. Why
Sorry to hear
why
that.
should I no but why should people care, I guess, is the question. Or how, you've written a lot to help make people, I think, feel like poetry is accessible to them. So where does that passion come from, and what do you say to people who maybe don't see what they had, like what poetry could be for them, I guess?
I guess the question is, what kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world where everything is entertainment all the time? Do you want to just follow news cycles constantly? Do you just want to respond to the endless stimulus of contemporary culture? Because we have a kind of unprecedented situation now where, on the one hand, people are trying to sell us something all day long, all the time. We live in a tremendous marketing age. Everything is marketed to sell to us. And then we also have, 360, 780, 1,200 cable channels, I don't know, and a news cycle that's 24 hours long. And you can live just constantly in external stimulus. But I believe that we also have interior lives. And if you care about your interior life or your affective life, if you care about the way in which you think to yourself when you were alone with yourself, if you think about the way you feel and what feeling means to you, then I think there's a place for poetry in your life. That poetry speaks to our interior and our spiritual lives in another kind of way. It gives us a language for our own feelings, for our own interior thoughts, for our own inner life. And I don't know, I think the world will be a better place. I think I'm a better person for trying to find a language for my own interior life. And I think poetry, better than almost anything else, speaks to that access to our inner lives through language, because it's a language art.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, there's something about this introspection of the individual that then makes us sort of live differently in the world as well. And something that you had that you've written in your how to read a poem and fall in love with poetry. You talk a lot about reading a poem out loud, and I think when you say out loud, you don't necessarily mean out loud. You can read it sort of out loud in your own mind, but that there's something powerful about speaking a poem out loud. And so you brought a poem to share with us today. And I thought maybe you could just demonstrate the power of reading a poem out loud. And I know that we provided copies here for everyone who's in the live audience, and that the alumni who are joining us online, I know that they've also had the opportunity to hopefully read the poem and engage a little bit. And so, yeah, we'd love to have you share that with us. Is there anything you would want to tell us about this poem before you begin?
Well, first I want to say something about reading poetry aloud.
Sure.
Because you asked me about that. When you read a poem yourself, poetry is the one art in which your body, your voice actually becomes the vehicle. That is, I believe the poem is not alive when a poet writes it. The poem is alive when someone reads it. That poetry is a kind of transaction between the poet, the poem, and the reader. And the reader, I mean, how to read a poem is I stand in for the reader, not for the writer. That the poem is actualized through the reader. When you read a poem, of course you're reading the words of another, but you're using your voice, your vocal cords, your body as the vehicle of that poem. That isn't true when you look at a work of art. I mean, you can have a wonderful experience of a work of art, but your body is not the vehicle of that art. It doesn't come alive through your vocal cords. That is true in poetry. So you can hear it with, I'd call it your inner ear, but also in poetry, the way in which the thing is said is indistinguishable from what is being said. That is, when you read a news report, you can read the story and you remember the way in which, you remember what's being said, but you don't remember the way in which it was said. That's not important in a news story. But in a poem, the way in which the thing is said is indistinguishable from what is being said. It is the vehicle. When we were in school, that was called the heresy of paraphrase. But I like something that the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam said. He said, if a poem can be paraphrased, then the sheets haven't been rumpled, poetry hasn't spent the night. So you got to rumple the sheets.
Yeah.
So this poem is called A Partial History of My Stupidity. I got the idea from the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who said, he wrote in a poem called Account, the history of my stupidity would fill many volumes. That seemed funny to me. Yeah. So you have to be a certain age. So I couldn't write the whole thing. So I just started to do a chapter.
Partial history.
Partial history. Traffic was heavy coming off the bridge, and I took the road to the right, the wrong one, and got stuck in the car for hours. Most nights I rushed out into the evening without paying attention to the trees, whose names I didn't know, or the birds, which flew heedlessly on. I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along, like a tiger that wanted to spring, but was still afraid of the wildness within. The iron bars seemed invisible to others, but I carried a cage around inside me. I cared too much what other people thought and made remarks I shouldn't have made. I was silent when I should have spoken. Forgive me, philosophers. I read the Stoics but never understood them. I felt that I was living the wrong life, spiritually speaking, while halfway around the world, thousands of people were being slaughtered, some of them by my countrymen. So I walked on, distracted, lost in thought, and forgot to attend to those who suffered far away, nearby. Forgive me, faith, for never having any. I did not believe in God, who eluded me. Should we say something about it?
Yeah. Would you have something that you'd want to share? And then maybe we can open up for a couple questions or comments here.
I think a poem can take you on a journey. And I don't want to explicate my own poem, but I would say it's a journey. And the journey would be, how can you get in a poem, the space of a short lyric poem, from a mistake about taking a wrong turn in traffic to a mistake about the deepest metaphysical question we have about God. So to get there from one place to another in a poem, that's a bit of a trick in a short poem. And so this poem is structured as a kind of escalating errors, I'd say, escalating elements of not knowing, beginning with something pretty small and getting larger as you go. So it sort of moves from the miniature to the gigantic, I'd say.
Yes, right here. We'll pass you the microphone.
I heard there are many phrases about the right life and the wrong life. So, according Adler said, wrong life cannot live rightly. So, is modern life a right life or wrong life? What's the place of your poetry in such kind of life? So, why?
Thank you.
I wasn't in this poem. I'm glad to answer your question, but in this poem, I wasn't speaking about everyone or reading right in the right or the wrong life. I was talking about myself. I don't know if you've ever sort of had a moment in your journey where usually you just feel like you're doing the right thing, but every once in a while you feel like you're doing the wrong thing, that you've somehow taken a job or you've met the wrong person or you fill it in with your own life. You've moved to the wrong city. In other words, instead of doing the thing that suddenly seems right, you've done the thing that suddenly seems wrong. Now, sometimes that can be odd and it can change, but sometimes you can just go, you've done the wrong thing. And I think there's a kind of, it's not exactly a joke, but a modification here. I felt I was living the wrong life, and then you go, spiritually speaking. That is not practically I wasn't doing the wrong thing here, but in my spiritual life, I was doing the wrong thing here. And then while I was concerned about my own spiritual life and what I'd done wrong in it, I suddenly realized halfway around the world, thousands of people are getting killed at that very moment while I'm worrying about my own interior life and my own spiritual journey. Thousands of people being slaughtered, and some of them are by my countrymen. Some of them are by our people, my people. And so that's a kind of implication that while you were worrying about your soul, your country was doing something else. And maybe you should have been paying attention to that. So that's what I meant specifically in this poem. It wasn't a diatribe against modern life or against contemporary life. It wasn't saying we should go back to living on the land, say. I mean, we all have different feelings about what's wrong in contemporary life and what might be going well in contemporary life. My poem is a little more specific to that, about a personal journey. I mean, do I wish there were things in contemporary culture that were different? The answer is yes. Am I in charge of that? The answer is no. Yeah. Do I wish people would unplug a little some of the time? Okay, yes, I admit it. Do I wish people would read and spend time with themselves and with poems? Yes, I think that would help our interior lives.
I think we have one more question here in the front, and then I have one online that I want to make sure we get to.
Thank you. My name is Abdullah. I'm from Nigeria. Should I call it a question? The stanza 5 of this poem, where you talk about I care too much what other people thought. I think in reality, the stanza actually depicts what happened in reality. When you care so much about what people say or the thoughts of people, then you tend to give remarks that you shouldn't have given. And when you're cautioned, the repercussion is you become silent when you're supposed to talk. So I so much like that stanza.
Yeah, thank you. It's very observant. Do you know about Ariki? So Ariki is a kind of praise poetry in Nigeria and various tribes. It's a remarkable thing. It's a sort of oral poetry of people having praise names. So the poets, Oriki, yeah, yeah.
You pronounce it like
Okay, sorry.
we had a pronunciation.
Yeah, I never heard anyone say it. I just
yeah.
read about it.
It's actually from a tribe.
Uh-huh.
We call it Oriki.
Oriki, yeah, Oriki. Excuse me.
So just like eulogizing
Yeah.
your forefather,
Okay.
Yeah.
it tells story about your backgrounds.
Yeah. I love this idea of poetry and praise names and telling the story of
The story of ancestors.
story of
and things.
ancestors. Yeah.
Well, and we actually had a question that came in online from someone named Andy, who is asking about sort of the poetry that you've written about sort of the blue collar worker, or he talks specifically about cold calls, and you describe sort of your father's life and this, which is sort of maybe paying homage to your forefathers as well. But that the question is that throughout your life as a poet, as an editor, for the poems of Philip Levine, he says, you choose to reveal the world the difficulties and pain of the working class. Is this because, as you say in your poem, mergers and acquisitions, there is something else that drives us, a failed grief, a lost radiance that you are trying to capture for all of us? It's quite the question.
Andy.
Andy, we're not sure who you are, but that was a good one.
Andy. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. For the close reading and the observation, from the beginning, I wanted, at first when I started, I read poetry and I thought I should, because I wanted to be a poet so desperately, I thought I should make myself more like poetry. And then at a certain point, I began to feel, well, maybe I should also make poetry a little more like me, that maybe it wasn't my job to be John Keats, much as I loved him, or to be John Milton, as extraordinary he was, or Robert Lowell. Maybe my job was to write the poems that I could write. And I started to feel strongly that there were people that ought to be in poetry, that I cared about, who I didn't see reflected in poetry. And if you weigh the world's poetry, you'd go like 95% love and the passing of the seasons, 5% work. But what are people doing most of their lives? I mean, believe me, I want to write about love and the passing of the seasons too, but people spend their lives working and describing those lives and describing what people do when they work, sort of unsung people, forgotten people. Then I began to discover that's a stream in American poetry too, from Whitman. And I'm glad, Andy, you mentioned Philip Levine, one of my dear friends, whose work I've been editing since he died because I'm his literary executor. He brought the working class people of Detroit into his poems. This is an important streak in American poetry. And so much as I loved culture, I also wanted to describe the kind of people that I grew up with in Chicago. And I come from a lower middle class working background. And the poem Cold Calls is about my father, who was a salesman. And in that poem, it's about how towards the end of his life, my father had sort of gotten moved out, and he was making what in business is called cold calls. That is, he'd outlived all of his customers. It's a term in business where when you make a cold call, you basically are calling people you don't know. It's incredibly humiliating and difficult because instead of calling on clients that you know and have a personal relationship, he's 75 years old and he's calling people he doesn't know and trying to sell them boxes. So that's what that poem is about. It's about working and about what it is to try and work for your family and the endless humiliations that can come along with working and what that's like in both blue collar and white collar thing. Yeah. I'll just tell you my father's favorite expression. Sure. When I tell him stories about academics behaving badly, which he liked because he thought academics wouldn't be like working people, and he'd say, excuse me for the language, you have to kiss some strange asses. This was the sum of his wisdom about working. Yeah.
Well, I think I read, some of the introduction to your Poet's Choice anthology that you put together, and there was a line in there that really struck me, and you just, I think, brought it up now as you talked about how poetry sacramentalizes experience. And for those who may not be familiar with the idea of a sacrament, what exactly did you mean by that? I think I have an idea of what you meant by that. But, how do you think that the ordinary can become extraordinary or set apart?
I mean, you're saying exactly what I was thinking. So Poet's Choice is a book of columns that I wrote for the Washington Post. Every week I chose a poem and wrote about it. And in introducing this book, I talk about the way that poetry takes experience that otherwise would go unnoticed, and it says this is worth noticing. And maybe even more, there are still vestiges of this. Poetry began with religion, and it had a kind of mystery. And there's an element of the sacred that starts with poetry. And I'm not talking about just sacred poetry like psalms and hymns, which are extraordinary in their own right. I'm also talking about the way that poetry blesses ordinary experience by paying attention to it. And so by what I'm calling sacramentalizing of experience is taking profane experience and saying, there's something holy about this too, that this matters. And there are two forms of poetry in every poetry in the world, praise and lamentation. They're two sides of the same thing. Praise means the world is passing, how can we save it? I love this world, I want to deify it. And that's what you get in a lot of Whitman, say. Lamentation, the world is passing. How incredible is our mortality? How terribly sad is our mortality? How can we ease the passage of those who are moving from one world to the next? So we're taking ordinary experience of ordinary people, so-called, and we're saying the poetry, the world of these people matter too. And that poetry is a way of making the unsacred sacred. It's not doing it through religion. It's not the authorized testimony of a church. It is the testimony of an individual, an unauthorized testimony. That is someone who comes without a doctrine to back it up, without the church of any one religion. It is the story of an individual saying, our lives matter. And we want to care about these lives by writing about them. And so we take something ordinary and we say, this we can memorialize through language. This we can remember.
That's beautiful. We were talking in the room before coming out here about a Fulbright scholar that we had from the United States who went to Honduras, who happens to be a priest, since we're talking about the sacraments. But his project was to write poetry with a group of orphans in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. So it was a all-girls orphanage. And through the time that he was there, you know, they wrote poetry every day. They memorized poems. They had a chance to sort of, they talk about sort of excavating their grief through lines of meter and verse. And those poems are available online. They were published through Poetry Magazine, and I know that they're making a documentary about the lives of those girls. But he came and shared the poems with us at the State Department in a conference room, right, which was the most bizarre experience, you know, because you're there with this long table and the fluorescent lights, and you're reading this 12-year-old girl talking about the mother who left her to go work in Mexico, and how one day she hopes she'll be able to come to her and say, I forgive you. You know, and we were just, tears were streaming down our face. In the middle of this, you know, we had the American flag up there. It was really great. But I think that there's, you know, you talk a lot about that there's this like personal, passionate, sometimes, you know, grieving, whatever that intense feeling is, that comes out, and it gives a window sort of into another person's soul, but also into, you know, the time and the place and all those things. And we have a question actually from a visiting professor from India at Rutgers named Vinod, who talks about poetry being the outcome of passion and extreme feelings of pain, regrets, mistakes, longings, and so on, which we've covered. But he also asked, does, you know, expression in poetry helps moderate extreme passion? Do you agree with that? What are your thoughts? Do you think poetry helps to moderate those passions, or does it do something else?
Moderate would not be my word for what poetry does. I would say articulate, give a language to, express, transform, but moderate somehow suggests that it tamps it down a little, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, there are poems that do that, but there are poems that don't do that. I mean, perhaps they ritualize grief a little, but I wouldn't say moderate wouldn't be my word. But yes, I do think that by turning something inarticulate to something in language, you do change it. you do give it a voice. But I wouldn't say moderate it. I would say you articulate it.
Do we have any questions here before I go on? Okay, we have someone here in the front. Oh,
Good morning, Mr. Hirsch. I'm here. I noticed that at the beginning of the poem, mostly the second and first stanzas, well, you talk about nature, and that reminds me of romantic poets, and I believe that both are very different. The first one is more related towards the path to faith, and in the second one, I believe, well, there is a tiger, and it seems to be lost in the rainforest. So I don't know if this has anything to do with this dichotomy of praise and lamentation that what you were talking about.
You're talking about more specifically about a partial history in the poem, Partial History of My Stupidity. Yes. Well, it's first of all, I'm sort of judging myself. Most nights I rushed out in the evening without knowing the names of paying attention to the trees. The trees are out there. I'm not paying any attention to them because I'm lost in my own thoughts. So maybe if I were a little less lost in my thoughts, I would pay a little more attention to the trees. And then on top of it, I don't know their names. So I'm kind of judging myself for not paying attention to the trees, not paying attention to the physical world, the natural world, and not knowing how to name it. And then, or the birds, which flew heedlessly on. The tiger is something else, which is, the tiger is an analogy. That is, I couldn't relinquish my desires or accept them, and so I strolled along like a tiger that wanted to spring. That is, my inner life is like a tiger that wanted to spring, but was too afraid of the wildness around it. So the tiger is not an actual tiger like the trees here. The tiger's an analogy. Say, I feel like that tiger that wants to spring but is too afraid of the incredible wildness it finds inside itself. But there is a kind of ecological critique of myself there for not paying more attention to the natural
outside world. Yeah. We had a question from Lena in Algeria. She's going to be participating in the Between the Lines program. And she's also asking about the poem. And she's wondering about, it seems like there's a moment where you question your faith, but then ultimately turn to God. And so the question is that a contradiction, or what's happening there?
I think there's something kind of amusing there. First of all, it seems to me contradictory or comical to apologize to faith, not a person. Usually you apologize to a person. I'm apologizing to an ideal of faith, and then for not having any. And then I think even more contradictory or striking is when I go, I did not believe in God who eluded me. The word eluded suggests, it doesn't say I do not believe in God who does not exist. It goes, I do not believe in God who eluded me. That is, there's probably a God out there eluding me, getting away from me, but I can't find him. And so I think that suggests, in my opinion, there probably is a God out there, but I don't believe in him because I can't find him. So that's what the poem is turning on there. Sure. And I think that contradiction strengthens the critique, the self-critique in this poem about knowing and not knowing. And it's really about what you don't know.
We have one more question here from the audience, and please make sure to say your name and the program you participated on.
Okay, hi, I'm Madison. I participated in the Nestle Y exchange program to China a couple of summers ago, and my question is about kind of God and faith and spirituality. So I was wondering, in this poem specifically, but also in your writing in general, has your Jewish heritage influenced how you think about the world, or if you've written on it at all, or if it has influenced your poetry or when you were reading works for other Eastern European writers, if that has influenced how you think?
Thank you for the question. Very much so. I recently wrote a poem called God and Me. And I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a rabbi, and I said, yeah, well, the poem, we were talking about the poem, and I said, yes, the poem says that I don't believe in God. She goes, yes, that's a very Jewish position. So questioning God, that's very, you can't even win. They claim you So Judaism, the questioning of God, is actually part of the religion of Judaism. It makes space for that kind of question. There are several. First of all, I grew up as a non-religious Jew, and I would say that I kind of made up a Jewish tradition for myself intellectually and culturally. And some of the parts of that tradition are extremely important to me. But I'm not a believer. I'm not a person who goes regularly to synagogue like that. But the elements of Judaism that have been really important to me in my poetry and in my life is that one, the Jewish religion is the religion of the book. Jews are the people of the book. And reading and critical thought has always been important to Judaism. Judaism is a historical religion. That is, there's a sense of a people in time. There's an idea of exile that's important. And at the root of Judaism is a quest for justice. And I believe that the quest for justice is also important in poetry. So my hodgepodge Judaism, it doesn't line up with any particular creed exactly of Reform Jews or conservative Jews or Orthodox Jews, but I've sort of made up a kind of humanitarian Judaism that's been important to me theologically and historically and in terms of my reading.
Yeah, I think what you say about justice is really interesting, because something that came to mind when I was thinking about saying poetry out loud is sort of like the spoken word as a form, and even poetry slams or hip hop and rap. And we actually had a question from the Rosa Parks Library in Soweto, Johannesburg, about rap, and if you think that it could be, if it's contemporary poetry, and if rap artists are poets, and if what they're doing in some cases is writing and rapping in the pursuit of justice.
Definitely. Rap artists don't want to be called poets because they're afraid they'll lose their audience and their royalties will shrink tremendously and they'll have to take vows of poverty. But no, rap is a form of poetry. It's a form of oral poetry. It's not the only poetry, but it's a form of contemporary poetry. It's verbal play. It uses rhyme. It has many. Usually the subjects, they don't only have to do with social justice, but often they do. Much of rap historically has been protest poetry. My only complaint, I would say, would be not that rap is, I think rap is poetry. My only complaint is that it's not the only kind of poetry. And that I wish that people who follow rap would also follow us into written poetry. Because I think that there are things that oral poetry does, slam poetry does, that written poetry can't or doesn't do. But there are also things that written poetry does that rap can't do. And I think that, poetry is a wide spectrum. It's a big tent. It starts with, I call them miniature genres, like riddles and proverbs are forms of poetry. Children's games are forms of poetry. Song is a form of poetry. In many oral cultures, song and poetry is the same word. There's no difference between them. Exactly. So I just think that rap is a crucial form of contemporary poetry, but not the only one.
Sure. Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone's brain. We have one in the back here.
Hi, I'm An Tu Ngo, and I was part of the IA program to Vietnam. I just wanted to hear your comments on the potential of poetry, given the shrinking audience in the US, for example, to kind of make a leap across cultural and geographic barriers. Would it be through translation, and where do you see the place of translation with regards to American poetry?
You're just pitching it right up for me. I really appreciate the.
I told them all.
I'll pay you later for that question. First of all, I should say it would be preferable always to read poetry in its own language. It would be far superior to be able to read Vietnamese poetry in Vietnamese. It's better to read Korean poetry in Korean. It's better to read Chinese poetry in Chinese. There's no question about that. It's better to read haiku, Japanese haiku, in Japanese. It's better to read Nigerian poetry in various different tribal languages, which there are a lot of. It'd be better to read Greek poetry in Greek. So that goes without saying. And I admit I should know all these languages. But realistically, none of us are going to know all the languages. I would love to know Turkish so that I could read the poet Nazım Hikmet. I would love to read Hungarian so I could read the poet Yosef Attila. I would love to be able to read Pushkin in Russian. I'd love to be able to read Basho in Japanese. But realistically, I'm not going to learn all the languages in all the places in the world. I'll do what I can. Translation makes those poems available to us. I simply would not be able to read some of the great poetry of the world, for example, the poetry of the Tang Dynasty, if I didn't read it in translation. And so it goes. And this poetry in translation gives us the essence of different cultures, gives us tones and vocalities and ways of thinking that are different than our own. And I think enlarge our world. If even in our little world of poetry, if we only read contemporary American poetry, we'd have a very limited view of the world. And one of the things I'm continually trying to convince my students, graduate students who want to be poets, is that if you only read your contemporaries in English, you're going to have a very narrow view of what poetry is. Whereas if you read Sappho, if you read the Renaissance English poets, if you read the 19th century French poets, you're going to have a wider view of what poetry is, and also, by the way, of what people are and how they feel. So I just think that poetry around the world enlarges our world. And I think American poetry and American culture would be deeper and wider if poetry had a fuller articulation and more people understood and read it from different places.
And I think I want to get in this last question here from Algeria, and it sort of dovetails into something I've been thinking about too. She asks about this particular line in A Partial History where you say, I carried a cage around inside me, but goes on to ask, is that possibly referring to not having a choice in your own life or not being able to change current events or to change the world around you? And so I wanted to leave that as one question. And then my follow-up is, do you think that poetry, that art gives you a means to have an impact too, that it's not that you don't have a choice or you don't have a means? Even through art, there is a means. And if you could explain that a little bit.
Well, I carried a cage around inside me meant that I was limiting myself, that I've built it's not someone else's cage, it's that I've built the cage through my own restrictions, my own repressions, my own limits, and I felt then locked in by my own consciousness, my own cage. We all had parents who did some work on us, and we all carry those parental voices inside of us, and that's the cage that I mean. But your question is then something else.
Right. So she had asked about, whether or not you feel like you have a choice or if there was a sense of powerlessness in the face of this recognition that, thousands are being slaughtered. And so similarly, my question is, does poetry also give you a means to do something about it? Maybe it's not what you would expect, but what is that connection there?
Poetry is a form of action. It's a form of putting words in action. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's the same thing as protesting exactly. I don't think it means that we then don't have civic duties to vote and to express our opinion as citizens and so forth. But I think poetry is a way of bringing our feelings, our thoughts, our experiences, the experience of the individual to the community. And I think that poetry is not just written about interior subjects, it's also written about social subjects. Sure. And it's the duty of poets to speak out in the way that poets see things and the way that we experience things. And consciousness matters. Mm-hmm. I think poetry has an important role to play. I think all the arts have an important role to play in a democracy. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll just go a little further on that, sure, on that line, that poetry is not the only, it's my art, but it's not the only art. But there are many voices in America now who don't think that the arts matter. And I'm here to tell you that I think they do. And that the fact that there's never been a culture without music, for example, suggests that music matters to human beings. It's not just because there are some of us who happen to like classical music or like folk music, or some of us who like written poetry, some bohemians like it. If there's never been a culture without it, it suggests that poetry and music are ways of knowing that we can't get elsewhere. And that when we betray those, when we don't honor those, then that part of human experience is lost. And ever since Lascaux and the cave paintings, there's been an attempt in visual art to try and turn the world visually. Now, the fact that that happens, that kind of ornamental experience, that kind of visual experience happens in every culture, suggests that it matters. And I'm calling that a way of knowing. That what I mean by that is it gives us access to knowing things that we can't get in other places. And then when we don't pay attention to that, when we don't pay attention to music or to art or to literature, those ways of knowing then are lost. And I think they have a tremendous amount to contribute to our cultural and social conversations.
Yeah. Thank you. That was
Thank you.
wonderful. Unfortunately, we've ran out of time for today's program. So thanks to everyone who is joining us online. Please continue the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. For those of you who are here in New York with us today, please make sure to fill out the survey that's on your seat and stay with us for a chat with Ed afterward. And to everyone, I hope that you'll be joining us next time here at Washington Circle. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us. Take care. Thank you.
That was fun.